The laughter started before the bidding did. Daniel Holt raised his paddle for lot 19, and the sound that came from the VIP row was not subtle. Marcus Ellison, CEO of Ellison Prestige Motors, the most prominent classic car dealership group in the state, leaned back in his leather chair and said it loud enough for the entire hall to catch it. $600 for that. He did not lower his voice. He gestured at the car on the rolling platform with the casual authority of a man who had spent 30 years deciding what things were worth, and the people near him smiled, because that was the appropriate response when someone with his kind of certainty made a pronouncement. Daniel did not look at Marcus, he looked at the car. The 1960 Ford Mustang prototype concept shell sat under the auction hall lights in a condition that justified nobody's optimism. The paint was gone in wide strips. The frame had surface rust from the front fascia to the rear quarter. The passenger door had been wired shut and not unwired since. The interior, visible through the cracked windshield, had surrendered to moisture and time. The auctioneer read the condition report in the flattened voice of someone presenting a list of problems no one expects to buy. Two people in the front rows stood and stretched. Someone near the exit checked their phone. Daniel raised his paddle. $600, he said. The laughter from the VIP section was polished and brief. His 7-year-old daughter Rosie, sitting beside him with a folded program she had been annotating since they arrived, looked up at the sound and then looked at his face. His face was calm. She settled back into her seat. The gavel came down. Daniel Holt was the new owner of Lot 19 for $600, and Marcus Ellison was already looking at his phone. 60 days later, the city of Harwick stopped. Stay with this one, every detail matters. 8 years before the auction, Daniel had been lead restoration specialist at Fenwick Classic Works, the most respected private restoration workshop in the Northeast. His clients included 3 national museums, 2 international auction houses, and a private collector in Geneva. He had run the restoration floor by the time he was 31. His colleagues called him the listener, not because he was quiet, though he was, but because he diagnosed cars the way a physician diagnoses a patient, by paying attention to what the machine was saying before deciding what needed to be done. He left Fenwick on a Wednesday in March, 4 years before the auction. His wife Renee had died of an illness that moved faster than anyone's ability to prepare for it when Rosie was 2 years old. For 14 months after that, Daniel kept making the drive to Fenwick, kept doing the work, kept coming home after dark to a daughter who deserved more of him than the road could spare. It was Rosie who ended the arrangement, in the way that small children end things, not by asking, but by needing. He found a smaller workshop on the west side of Harwick, took the jobs that came through word of mouth, delivered them on time. To the people who saw him across the workbench, he was a competent local mechanic who worked alone and went home early. To the small, careful world of serious restoration, his name still meant something. He had simply stopped reminding anyone of that. The night after the auction, after Rosie was asleep, Daniel opened a wooden box from the kitchen shelf. Inside was a black and white photograph, soft at the edges, showing a man in his early 30s standing beside a car in front of a Texas workshop. The car had the long, low profile of the 1960 Mustang prototype concept, one of only a handful that had ever existed. The man beside it had his hand on the roof, looking past the camera with the expression of someone in the middle of a very good day. The man was Daniel's father, George Holt. The year was 1963. Daniel had been carrying the documentation for 3 years. The original title, a build record from a Ford Archives request, and a factory designation sheet with a production code that matched, to the digit, the VIN on the frame of Lot 19. He had confirmed the match before he drove to the auction. He had known what he was going there to buy before the doors opened. This was not a car he had found. This was a car he had been looking for. George had sold it in 1991, during a year when the family's finances required it. He had spoken of it afterward only briefly, with a shift in the eyes, and then not again. He had not said he regretted it. he had never needed to. Rosie appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding her stuffed elephant. She had come for water and found her father at the table with an old photograph. "Is that Grandpa?" she asked. "That's Grandpa. Is that our car?" It was his car, a long time ago. She studied the photograph seriously. "It looks different from today." "It will look different again," Daniel said. "Can you actually fix it, Dad? It was pretty bad." "Everything that's broken has a place where it started," he said. "You find that place and you work forward." "How long?" 60 days. She nodded once, with the gravity of someone approving a plan, and went back to bed. The flatbed arrived at Daniel's workshop on Carver Street the following morning. He spent the entire first day doing nothing except looking, moving around the car slowly, pressing his palm against panels, testing every hinge. Not with tools, with attention. The work had to know its own shape before it could begin. What he found changed the calculation considerably. The frame rails were sound, not serviceable sound. For a vehicle that had surrendered its cosmetic layers entirely, the structural integrity was remarkable. The skeleton was honest. The car had not been abused. It had been neglected, which was a different problem and a more solvable one. The engine was a 260 cubic inch V8. It had not run in years. The carburetor was beyond cleaning. The valve cover gaskets had failed, but when Daniel removed the valve covers and examined the cylinder walls, they were not scored. The block had not cracked. This was a damaged engine. It was not a dead one. He called his friend Marcus Webb that evening. Not the CEO, Marcus Webb, who had worked alongside Daniel at Fenwick for 6 years and now ran a trim shop across town. "I need you on this one," Daniel said. "What is it?" "A 1960 prototype shell, my father's car." A pause. "Daniel." 60 days. A longer pause. "From the condition it was in at the auction, I saw it." "Everyone saw it. I also saw Marcus Ellison's face when I raised my paddle." The man looked personally offended. "Are you in?" "I'll be there Saturday. I won't take money for it." Subscribe right now, because what happens inside that workshop over the next 60 days is something you need to see through to the end. On the 8th day, Daniel drove to Kellerman Auto Supply to source gasket material. He was reading specifications at the parts rack when the door opened behind him. Marcus Ellison stood at the counter, speaking with the store owner about a period-accurate display component for an Ellison Prestige promotional event. His voice had the cadence of someone accustomed to being the sharpest instrument in any room. The store owner, a man named Carroll who had been selling parts to serious mechanics for 28 years, glanced past Marcus toward Daniel and said, in the easy tone of someone who had held conversations in his store for 3 decades, "The gentleman at the Mustang rack, they did restoration documentation work for the Henry Ford Museum and the Barrett-Jackson Archive team, among others." Marcus turned. He looked at Daniel the way one professional looks at another, as a variable to be assessed. Daniel was reading the back of a parts box and did not fully turn around. He nodded toward Carroll. Marcus bought what he needed and left. On the sidewalk, he paused. He had caught the name when Carroll said it, Holt. He had encountered that name once before at an industry conference in a conversation about a restoration for a private Swiss collector. The evaluator's report had used language he did not often see in technical assessments. He sat in his car for a moment, then drove back to his office and asked his assistant to pull the professional record for a Daniel Holt, formerly of Fenwick Classic Works. What came back did not match the man he had seen at the auction. The worn jacket, the 7-year-old on his arm, the $600 bid. The Henry Ford Museum Commission. The Barrett-Jackson Archive, a private collection in Zurich, assessed by an independent evaluator whose report described the restoration as technically the most faithful work of its classification completed in the past decade. Marcus closed the file. He did not call anyone. He went back to his afternoon. Inside the workshop on Carver Street, The weeks moved the way serious work moves, not dramatically, but with the accumulating weight of things done correctly, one after another, without shortcuts. Rosie came after school and did her homework on a folding table near the back wall. On the 11th evening, she looked up and said, "Dad, the primer color on the door panel is different from the photograph." Daniel looked at the panel, then at the photograph of George Holt pinned to the workshop wall. How different. She brought the photograph to him carefully. "The car in the picture is darker, more like the sky before a storm. This one is too flat." He looked at the photograph, he looked at the panel, she was right. The 1960 prototype had been finished in a Ford color designation that predated the standard Mustang palette by 4 years. The mixing formula existed in archival documentation, but the dye compounds had shifted across 6 decades, and no commercial supplier in Harwick could hit the reference chip with the accuracy the work required. He spent 3 evenings going through a binder from his Fenwick years, factory color documents, mixing ratios, spectrophotometry data compiled across nearly a decade of restoration work. The formula was on page 31. He called Marcus Webb, who borrowed a spectrophotometer from a colleague in the automotive finishing trade, and over 2 days of careful trial and adjustment, Daniel mixed the paint in the workshop. When he held the test panel next to the photograph, the match was as close as a photograph could confirm. Marcus Webb held the panel at arm's length and was quiet for a long time. "Daniel," he finally said, "I know. Ellison is going to see this car at some point. You understand that?" Daniel was already setting up the spray equipment. On the 22nd evening, he turned the key for the first time. The engine caught on the 3rd attempt, rough and uneven for the first minute, then steadying into something that had authority in it. A V8 that had not run in more than 15 years was running in a workshop on Carver Street at 11:40 in the evening. Marcus Webb put both hands on top of his head and looked at the ceiling. Rosie, who had fallen asleep at her homework table, lifted her head at the sound and said, blinking, "Did the car wake up?" Daniel looked over at her. It remembered where it was. She laid her head back down. On day 41, the paint went on. The color came down over the bodywork, the way a resolved question settles, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation. The deep pre-storm blue held the light the way it had held it in the photograph, the way it had held it when George Holt stood beside it in Texas in 1963 and looked past the camera at something that had been a very good day. Marcus Webb arrived for the finishing work, walked into the workshop, and stopped in the doorway. "Say something," Daniel said. "I'm looking for the word," Marcus said. "Give me a minute." On day 57, a letter arrived from the Harwick Vintage Motor Exhibition, the city's largest annual concours event. The organizing board had reserved a central display position for a vehicle recently brought to their attention. The featured slot was allocated by committee selection, not open application. Daniel read it twice, then he showed it to Rosie. "They want to see our car," she said. "Looks like it. Is it ready?" He looked toward the workshop door. Almost. He did not know who had contacted the board. He would not find out until much later that Marcus Ellison had placed the call himself, 3 weeks after he pulled Daniel's professional file and read the Zurich evaluator's report. He had contacted the board through an intermediary, suggested without pressure that a vehicle of unusual historical significance might warrant the featured position, and returned to his office without telling anyone at Ellison Prestige. He had laughed at the car. He had laughed at the man who bought it. What he had seen on paper in his office had not settled easily. On the final night, Daniel and Marcus Webb finished the last adjustments at 2 in the morning. Both men were past tired in the particular way the end of serious work makes a person tired, not depleted, but emptied in the clean way a container is empty after being used for exactly what it was made for. Marcus picked up his jacket from the hook by the door. He stood looking at the car. 60 days, he said, from $600 of what that man called scrap. He shook his head slowly. "Do you understand what you've built here?" Daniel looked at the car. He looked at the photograph of his father on the workshop wall. "I brought it back," he said. The Saturday of the exhibition arrived with clear October light, the kind that is useful to paint finishes. Daniel drove the Mustang from Carver Street to Harwick Civic Green himself. The first time the car had moved under its own power on a public road. The engine sounded the way it was built to sound, low and unhurried, with the authority of a well-made thing running within its design. Rosie sat in the passenger seat in her good jacket, holding the 1963 photograph with both hands. "People are looking at us," she said. "It's a loud engine. I like that they're looking." The exhibition staff directed him to the central featured space, the exact center of the grounds where the walkways from all 4 entry points converged. He pulled in and cut the engine. In the silence after the motor stopped, a man standing 20 feet away turned to look. Then the man beside him. Within 3 minutes, without anyone organizing it, there were 15 people in a loose arc around the Mustang, and the arc was growing. Marcus Ellison arrived at 11. He saw the crowd from 40 yards out, larger and more concentrated than any other cluster on the grounds. He moved toward it. The crowd parted. He saw the car. The color stopped him first. The deep pre-storm blue of the 1960 configuration, holding the morning light the way the original formula intended. Then the proportions, the restored bodywork, the chrome re-gleaming with the clarity of something new, the engine bay visible through the open hood, clean and precise. He had seen Lot 19 at the auction. He remembered exactly what it had looked like. What stood in front of him now occupied the same physical space in his memory, but was otherwise something entirely different. Not restored in the commercial sense. Returned to what it had been, technically and historically, by someone who had known exactly what he was doing. He had laughed at this car. He had laughed at the man who bought it. Marcus walked forward through the remaining crowd. Daniel saw him from 10 steps away and did not move. He waited, the way he had waited when the gavel came down. Marcus stopped in front of the hood. He took the full measure of the car, nose to tail. Then he looked at Daniel. "How long?" 60 days from the auction." Rosie had moved to her father's side and was looking up at Marcus with the direct, uncomplicated curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to find powerful adults intimidating. Marcus looked at her, then back at Daniel. "I said something at the auction," he said. His voice had changed register from the one he used in boardrooms. "About the car, about you, in front of your daughter. It was the wrong thing to say." Daniel nodded once. He didn't expand on it, didn't offer the language that would close the distance faster than it deserved. Rosie looked up at Marcus with complete seriousness. "Dad says unkind things usually come from people who haven't looked closely enough yet," she said. "You looked closely just now." Marcus held her gaze. Something moved through his expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else. He looked back at the car. "Yes," he said quietly, "I did." The judges made their announcement at noon. Best in show, the 1960 Ford Mustang prototype concept, central featured space, owner Daniel Holt. Best restoration, same vehicle. The citation read, "A complete return to documented original specification from non-operational condition, executed in 60 days using period-correct materials and historically faithful technique, representing the most rigorous work of its classification in this event's history." The applause started at the edges and moved inward. Rosie grabbed her father's hand with both of hers. Aaron, Daniel's machinist contact, had driven to Texas the previous week without explanation and arrived just before noon with a passenger. A man of 71, silver-haired, moving slowly across the grass in dress shoes polished that morning with evident care. George Holt came through the edge of the crowd and stopped when the car came into view. He stood still for a long time. Then he moved forward and placed his hand flat on the hood, directly over the engine. His eyes were red at the edges. Rosie ran to him and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Grandpa, Dad fixed your car. It took 60 days. The color is exactly right. I helped pick it." George held his granddaughter with one arm and kept his other hand on the hood. When he could speak, What he said was quiet enough that only the people immediately around him heard it. "I know, sweetheart," he said. "I know." Daniel stood beside his father and said nothing. The car was there. The three of them were there. That was the complete statement. Later in the afternoon, Marcus found Daniel near the front fender while Rosie sat in the driver's seat, showing George each instrument gauge by name. "I'd like to talk to you," Marcus said, "when you have time for it." "About what?" "Ellison Prestige is starting a heritage division, serious restoration work, properly documented, properly attributed. We have the capital and the clients. We don't have what you have." He paused with the care of someone choosing words they cannot take back. "I think I found it this morning." Daniel looked at him steadily. "What would the work look like?" "That's what I'd want to discuss, on your terms." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He looked past Marcus at his father in the driver's seat, both hands on the original steering wheel, looking through the windshield with an expression that had no name except peace. "My terms start with being home by dinner," Daniel said. "That's understood. Then we can talk." He did not say yes. He said they could talk. It was the right answer for the moment, measured, honest, and open only to what the next conversation deserved. By late afternoon, the grounds had the quiet of an event that had ended well. Cars being started and driven out, the October light going long across the grass. The Mustang sat in the central space in the last of the afternoon sun, the pre-storm blue holding its depth the same way at 5 as it had at 9 that morning. That was how you knew the paint had been done correctly. Daniel drove home with Rosie asleep against the passenger window, the 1963 photograph in her lap, her hand resting on George Holt's image lightly. The engine ran beneath him with the steady authority he had rebuilt it to carry. He thought about what Marcus Ellison had said at the auction. $600, a pile of scrap. The words had not been kind, but they had been useful, not as motivation in the performative sense, but as clarity. On the 40th night, when the front fascia had failed a second profile check, and the schedule had no room to absorb it, and Marcus Webb had gone home and Rosie was asleep, and the workshop felt very large, it had been that clarity, the certainty of why he was doing this, that had kept his hands moving. There were things that got undervalued not because they lacked worth, but because the person doing the valuing had not looked long enough, or hard enough, or carefully enough. The car was one of those things. He had always suspected he might be one of them too. He turned onto Carver Street. The workshop light was on. He pulled the Mustang into the garage and cut the engine. The silence after the motor stopped was the good kind. He lifted Rosie from the passenger side without waking her and carried her toward the house. At the door, he turned back once. George was standing beside the car with his hand on the roof, not moving, not speaking, with the particular stillness of a man who has been given back something he had long since stopped expecting to hold again, and who understands that some moments do not arrive twice and does not want to rush through this one. The car was home. The man who brought it home went inside. The workshop light stayed on a little longer. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you never miss one. Drop a comment below. Tell us what moment hit you hardest. Was it Rosie and the photograph? Was it George's hand on the hood? Was it the 60-day count from a $600 bid? Share this with someone who is being overlooked right now, someone building something real without an audience. Like the video so more people find this story. We'll see you in the next one.
Share.